Hey guys. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to take a brand new Synology NAS that has never been set up before, and we're going to fully configure it. Now, this is going to be a long video, and in the timestamps below, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break everything up into individual pieces because there's probably going to be something that you've already seen in this video. But the goal is to walk you through the entire process from start to finish. So if you watch this entire video from start to finish, your NAS will be configured with some of the best practices, and you'll also understand the DSM operating system potentially a little better than you currently do. All right, this is Frank from the future. This video was a lot longer than I thought it was. So two things. One, check out the written instructions in the description of the video if you want to remove some of the fluff, because it will just give you the step-by-step guide that you can follow, though this goes into much greater explanation. So if you really want to understand DSM, this is it. Two, those timestamps that are in the description will be extremely, extremely helpful. If you understand something we're going through and you just want to skip through it, you'll be able to skip to the next chapter because the video goes through a lot. But I'll do my best in the description to break it down and make the timestamps as descriptive as I can so that you can at least follow it and make the decision yourself. So we're going to start from the very beginning. So this device here, as soon as you get it, what you're going to do is you're going to plug your hard drives into it. What I'd recommend, there's a little, I don't know if you could see it, there's a little lock there. After you put in your hard drives, I'd recommend that you lock them in. Even if you think you're never going to go in and open it, it's just better to ensure that you have that little protection. But you're going to put your hard drives in it, and then you're going to decide if you want to upgrade anything. Now, the NAS devices come standard. You can just basically plug them in and start using them. But some of these devices have certain features that you can upgrade. For this device in specific, I have upgraded the memory to 8 gigabytes. So certain devices will allow you to upgrade the memory. This DS923 Plus happens to be one of them. So the memory is upgraded to 8 gigabytes. On the back here, if you can see it, right here, I have a 10 gigabit NIC in it. Now, the important thing is, while everybody wants increased network speeds, you have to have the networking infrastructure to support that. So what I mean by that is you have to have a switch that supports 10 gig. And if you want a direct 10 gig line between a device and your Synology NAS, what you actually need is the device to have a 10 gig NIC as well. So 10 gig NIC, what is that? By default, these Synology NAS devices come with one, two, or four NICs. They're generally one, or I think all of them are 1 gig NICs. So what that means is, from a speed perspective, if you're transferring a file from your device to your NAS, everything's hardwired. The absolute fastest speed you're going to get is 125 megabytes per second. That's best case scenario. 10 gig just multiplies that by 10. Think of it like a bigger pipe. You can actually transfer larger files faster because the data can throughput faster than it could with a 1 gigabit NIC. Now, there are things you can do with the device out of the box, like SMB multi-channel, to increase those speeds, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. We will talk about that later. The only other thing that is installed in here are 2 NVMe drives, which can be used for caching or can be used as their own storage pools and volumes, which we will take a look at a little later. Other than that, this device is basically out of the box. It has 2 4 terabyte hard drives, and we are going to fully configure the DSM operating system now. All right, so up to this point, what I did is I plugged in the DS923 Plus, plugged the power into it, and I plugged in a network cable. So the very first thing that you have to do is you have to find the NAS on your network. So with a device that's connected to the same network, what you have to do is you have to go to find.synology.com. What this is going to do is it's going to search your local network for the actual device. It's going to take a second. If for some reason this does not work, you have 2 other options that you could use. The first is the Synology Assistant, which will basically do the same thing. It'll scan your network. And if that doesn't work, I would recommend downloading a IP scanner that will basically check all of the devices. I'll leave a link in the description to one of them that I have used in the past. But generally what that will do is that'll scan all the devices on your network and it will look to see if the device is showing up at all. But using one of those options, you should be able to find the device. So as soon as you find the device, what you're going to see is it's going to come up with the server name, IP address, and all this other information here. What we're going to do is select connect. At that point, if you agree to the terms, you can agree to the terms. You can continue on with their privacy statement. And then what it's going to do is it's going to start to go through the initial setup process for Synology DSM. So I would recommend that you automatically download the latest version. And then what it's going to do is any hard drives that you currently have plugged into the device, it is going to delete all of the data on them. So if you have any important data, meaning that you're using these hard drives from another device, you have to remove all the data before you get to this point. As long as you agree and you understand that everything will be deleted, you can select the checkbox and then you could select continue. For me, since there is data on these hard drives, what I have to do is actually type in the model number, but you probably won't have to do that. And you can select delete. All right, so at this point, DSM is going to start to install. It's probably going to take a few minutes here, nothing crazy, but as soon as it finishes installing, it's going to bring up the next stage, which we're going to have to configure our user account, and we'll get to that in a second. All right, so as soon as the operating system is installed, DSM, what it's going to do is it's going to reboot. After 10 minutes, it will automatically refresh this page. In my experience, it doesn't take that long. It's probably going to beep here in a second, and when it does, that means it's online and ready to go. So if you hear an audible beep from the device itself, that means it's ready. All right, so that was the audible beep that we were waiting for. The actual NAS now is going to be installing some built-in applications, and we're just going to have to wait a few seconds here, and then we'll be able to set up our user account and then proceed with the full setup process. Okay, so we are now at the DSM 7.2 setup process. So what we're going to do is we are going to select start, and then you're going to have to give your device a name, and then you have to set up your user account. I recommend setting up something that is secure, so I'm going to make this a little more secure. And then this checkbox here, what it will do is it will allow your device to be displayed in the web assistant. If you want to, you can check it off. If you don't want to, you don't have to. There's not a right or wrong answer. So basically, find.synology.com would display this device in the future if you check this off. So you can select next, and that will be the actual setup process for the user account. Now, moving on to the next step here. I'd recommend their recommendation, which is to install important DSM and package updates only. This will basically ensure that if there's any actual DSM updates that are important, mostly for security, it will automatically install those. Everything else you will have to install manually. I'd recommend you keep that on. And then if you want to sign in with a Synology account, you can. These are some of the benefits of the Synology account. We will sign in a little later, so I'm going to skip that for now. And then device analytics, this is up to you. You can either enable it or disable it. I'm just going to keep it unchecked and submit. And now what it's going to do is it's going to create your user account, and then we're going to be able to move on here to actually accessing DSM. So this is DSM. I will do all this later. Two-factor authentication, I would recommend that you enable. I'm not going to enable it right now, but you should have two-factor authentication enabled. So we'll take a look at that a little later. And this is adaptive MFA. We could take a look at this later. All right. So we now have to create our storage pool and our volume. So this is where all of the data on your NAS is actually going to live. So we're going to go through the actual setup process that they have. And with DSM 7, they really streamlined this, so this is not going to take that long. But if you select Create Now, it's going to walk you through the process of creating a storage pool and volume. So we can click Start. And now you have to pick your storage pool. So you have a few options here. And what you're going to see is I actually don't have all of the options, and we'll get to that in a second. So I have 2 hard drives installed right now. What that means is I can utilize SHR or RAID 1. Personally, I would not use RAID 0. RAID 0 will increase the performance of the drives, but any of the drives that fail will kill the whole storage pool. So you generally don't want to do that. What I'd recommend here is you actually open up Synology's RAID calculator, and I will leave a link in the description to that. But what you can do is you can add in your total number of drives. So for me, what you'll see is I have 2 4 terabyte drives. Now, I can't use RAID 5 and I can't use RAID 6 because I don't have enough hard drives. If I go in and increase this to 3, you'll see that now I can utilize RAID 5. If I increase it to 4, you'll see that now I can utilize RAID 6. So what's the difference between RAID 5, RAID 6, and SHR and SHR2? So RAID 5 will utilize the same sized hard drives. So if you were to come in here and you were to replace these two 4 terabyte drives with, we'll say, 8 terabyte drives, what you're going to see is that with RAID 5 and RAID 6, you'll be able to use them, but you actually have 7.3, which is 8 terabytes. You'll have 4 terabytes from 2 of the hard drives that is unusable. And the reason for that is because with RAID 5 or RAID 6, you can only use hard drives that are the same size, and it will go based on the lowest sized hard drive. So if these were 2 terabyte hard drives, it would be 2 terabytes across the board. So what we'll do is we'll switch this to SHR, and what you'll see is it's actually different. So SHR is Synology's hybrid RAID. So what SHR does is it allows you to use mixed sized hard drives and actually utilize some of the storage space. From what I've read, and I have not done any testing on this, but from what I've read, SHR is slightly slower from a performance perspective than RAID 5 is, but the benefit is that you can actually utilize the hard drive space if you have mixed size drives. So with SHR and these hard drives here, you'll have 14.5 terabytes of usable storage space. But with RAID 5, you'd only have 10.9. So the deciding factor here is ultimately going to be if you want flexibility or if you just want to use the same size hard drives. There's not a right or wrong answer. What you'll see is that with SHR, I can actually use SHR in 2 4 terabyte drives, but I cannot use RAID 5. So if you want to use RAID 5, you have to have at least 3 hard drives. If you want to use RAID 6, you have to have at least 4. The same is true for RAID 10. So RAID 0, I'd not recommend for a NAS, but RAID 10, what you'll see is you don't have enough hard drives. So you don't with 3 either, so you have to go to 4. RAID 10 is RAID 1 plus 0, so it's basically a striped mirrored pair. For most people, you're probably not going to use RAID 10. It is very good from a performance perspective, but for these small consumer NASs that only have 4 drives, you probably don't want to use RAID 10. But listen, it's up to you. If you want to use RAID 10, go for it. So now the other thing to discuss with RAID 5, RAID 6, SHR, and SHR2 is redundancy. So from a redundant perspective, RAID 5 and SHR can withstand 1 drive failure. So that means if any of the hard drives in the actual storage pool fail, you will not lose any of your data. For RAID 6 and SHR2, it means that 2 hard drives can fail. Any 2 hard drives can fail in the storage pool without you losing any data. So for most people, you'll use SHR, RAID 5 as one option, or SHR2, RAID 6 as the other option. If you're using the same sized hard drives, you probably want to use RAID 5 or RAID 6. If you're using different size hard drives, mixed size hard drives, you'd probably want to use SHR or SHR2. Your Synology NAS and the total hard drives that will be added to it will ultimately determine which is better from a redundancy perspective, meaning RAID 5 and SHR or RAID 6 and SHR2. If you have a 4-bay NAS, you probably want to use SHR or RAID 5. And if you have an 8-bay NAS, you probably want to use RAID 6 or SHR2. So I'd recommend that you use this to determine what type of storage pool you want to set up. So to get back into Synology DSM, what I'm going to set up is I'm going to set up SHR. So RAID 1 is a mirrored pair. I should mention that as well. So RAID 1, if you were to go back here, so it's a mirrored pair. So what it would allow you to do is just basically have 2 hard drives that are mirrored. If one dies, the other will be a direct mirror of that. I'm not going to set that up here. I'm going to use SHR. Now, if you have NVMe drives in the actual NAS, like I said earlier, you can create a storage pool off of the NVMe drives. I would not recommend you do that right now. I'd recommend you stick to the actual hard drives. Keep in mind, I should have mentioned this earlier, the actual hard drive bays, you can put in 3.5-inch hard drives or you can put in 2.5-inch SSDs. Whatever you want to use, it's up to you. Generally, from a cost perspective, you'll get a lot more storage space with 3.5-inch hard drives than you will with 2.5-inch SSDs, but SSDs will perform faster for various operations. But majority of people are probably going to use 3.5-inch hard drives. So we're going to go back to our SATA hard drives here, and then we are going to select next. And then we're going to select both of the hard drives, and we're going to select next again. And that's basically just adding them to the storage pool, those two hard drives. This is, if you want to check the drives, if they're brand new drives, I would recommend that you do this. This will basically just go through and check the drives to make sure there aren't any bad blocks or anything. If you do have any issues with the drives, I would recommend that you change them. So if this is a brand new NAS and brand new hard drives, I would recommend that you run a full scan on them. And especially if they're new, if it returns any errors, replace the drive right away. Don't play games. It's in the return window. Return it, get a new drive, and then go from there. I'm going to skip that for now. All right, so for the volume capacity, I would recommend, this is tough. I am a one volume person. I don't create multiple volumes. I have had many questions on people that do. I'm going to set this to the maximum available size. If you want to limit it to a smaller size, you can. But this is basically going to be the actual size of the volume. So this is where you're going to store your data. The volume stores the data. So for me, it's going to be a little under 4 terabytes of data here, but I'm just going to utilize the max. And then I'm going to select next. And now it's the file system. If you're using a NAS that supports Btrfs, I'd recommend that you use it. Synology recommends that you use it. It'll allow us to configure things like snapshots, which we'll take a look at later, and not actually utilize any real additional storage space. We will take a look at that though. ext4 in certain cases is slightly more performant. I have not tested them side by side to say that it is definitely faster. So take that with a grain of salt based on things I have read over the years. But Btrfs is going to be a better overall option for most people. That's my opinion. You can use ext4 if you want, but I'm going to use Btrfs, and then I'm going to select next. And this is going to be for volume encryption. So for volume encryption, this is going to be if you want to associate a password with this volume so that you have to unlock the volume to actually access it. For most home users, you're probably not going to need to do this. You can configure a encrypted shared folder, which we will take a look at a little later. And I think that that makes a little bit more sense for people. But if you want to encrypt the entire volume, you can encrypt the entire volume. I am not going to do that. So I'm going to select next here. And if you encrypt the entire volume, there's going to be a few additional steps that you have to actually complete. It's just basically the steps necessary to encrypt the volume. Like I said, I'm not doing that, but you can. So confirm the settings and select apply. It will confirm once again that all the data on these hard drives will be erased. You can select OK. All right, so we are now at the storage manager for DSM. Inside of here, what I would recommend you do is a few things. Right off the bat, schedule data scrubbing. Enable this, and you're going to enable it on your storage pool, and you can decide to run it either every 3 months or every 6 months. I generally do every quarter, but twice a year at minimum. And you can specify times in which you want to actually run these. I'm not going to do that, but you can specify specific times for it to run. The performance will be impacted slightly, so that's something that's important to keep in mind, but honestly, probably not something that's going to be noticeable unless you log into DSM itself. So save that, and it will actually run data scrubbing right away, but there's nothing on the drive, so it's going to basically just immediately finish. And we have our volume here and everything. We're using Btrfs. Everything looks like it's configured well. In the HDD SSD section, what you'll see here is these are the two 3.5-inch hard drives that I have available. If you ever want to view the health info, you can select them and click health info and then smart. And you can run individual tests on your hard drives. If you didn't perform the hard drive checks earlier and you want to test these hard drives to make sure there's no issues, you can do that like this. I would recommend using an extended test if they're new hard drives, make sure everything is good. But you can go through and run those tests and you can ensure that everything is good. The M2 drives, these are going to be used for potentially either a volume or SSD cache. SSD cache is a very interesting one because the majority of people, I've seen two camps. People just buy the NVMe drives because they kind of want the best of the best, and other people say it's completely not worth it. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. SSD cache can provide faster read and write times depending on what you use. If you're using a read-write cache, which can be configured by going to the storage pool here and selecting create and then create SSD cache. And what you'll see here is you'll have to mount it on a specific volume. For us, it's volume 1. And then you have two options, read-write cache and read-only cache. Read-write cache is a little riskier. If an SSD fails at the exact same time as a write operation is occurring, you might potentially have data corruption. For that reason, if you actually run through this, you have to use, they actually give you a disclaimer that data loss might occur, but you have to use RAID 1. That's it. So if you want to use NVMe cache and you want it to be read-write cache, you have to use RAID 1, which is a mirrored pair. So if one of the NVMe drives dies, you'll have a second one, so hopefully you won't lose any data. If you go back to read-only cache, you'll see that you can actually use RAID 0 or RAID 1. For most people, it's going to be RAID 0 is probably what you'll use. That will allow you to use both of the NVMe drives basically as one SSD. That's probably the best way to look at it. So you'll have double the performance, but if either of them fail, you will lose the entire SSD cache. But because it's read-only, there's no risk of data loss, so RAID 0 is the way to go. I'll set up, actually I'm not going to set up anything. We'll quickly look, I'm not going to set this up. We'll quickly look at creating a storage pool. So if you wanted to create an NVMe storage pool, you would have to go through the same thing and, select whatever RAID type you'd like to use. This is just saying that you can't hot swap the NVMe drives, which we know, and then you would have to select the drives. You can perform or skip the drive checks, and it's basically the same thing. So if you wanted to create an NVMe storage pool, that is exactly how you would do it. NVMe storage pools, I haven't seen many people using them. I think they'd be very good for virtual machines, which you can configure virtual machines on your NAS. So if you want to set up NVMe storage pools for your virtual machines only and just separate them, I think that's a great option. Other than that, if you want increased performance for your drives, especially if you're using 10 gig networking, you're probably better off with SSD cache. All right, so we're at the same step as before, and I'm just going to go through and create this read-only cache. And it'll say the drives have been erased, and it will run through and configure that. Okay. So we now have our storage pool configured. We have NVMe cache configured in a RAID 0 read-only cache. And for the storage manager, that's kind of it. Hot spare, you can, if you have an unused drive and you just want to leave it as a hot spare in case one of the hard drives in the pool was to die, it'll automatically start to use that hot spare so that it'll basically rebuild the storage pool and the volume on that hot spare drive. So you have an immediate fix for hard drives that have failures if they ever go into a critical state. I have seen some people use that. I have not personally done that with any of my NAS devices, but if you are using something like RAID 6, if you have an 8-bay NAS and you're using something like RAID 6, you can run through and configure this, and it's a great option for additional protection in case any of the drives fail. So from the storage pool, that's it. We are now brought back to the DSM operating system in which we will continue to configure it. So we are now inside of DSM. And what we're going to do, the first thing we're going to do is open up the control panel. The first thing I think that makes the most sense to walk through is this user and group section. So by default, the admin user is disabled. It's best to keep this disabled. But what you'll see is the user account we configured before is actually part of the administrator's group. So inside of these users and groups, what you actually have is you have multiple groups that users will be a part of by default. So the system default group users are part of by default. HTTP is for web services. I personally haven't really used those, but you might. And inside of the users, you can go through and you can actually create different users. Give them a password, and then what it will actually allow you to do is specify what groups they should be a part of. So for your administrators group, or at least the way that I normally do it, is I have an administrator user that I access DSM with. And then I have a regular user that I'll go through and access all of the shared folders with, which we will get to a little later. You don't have to do it that way, but that's how I do it. Now, inside of here, any of the groups that you create will actually exist here, and then you can go through and add this user to a specific group. When we get to shared folders, it'll make a little bit more sense than it makes right now. But the idea is that you want specific groups for specific users based on whatever access they should have. Now, if you're just a home user and you have a few people that are going to be accessing your NAS, you probably don't have to do this. But this is how you would do it if you wanted to. Okay, so at this point, that's the users and groups. We're going to get to this. We're going to go back to this in a second. But what I want to do here is I want to create a shared folder. And I quickly want to talk through the shared folder. What's the best way to describe it? The shared folder hierarchy. That's probably the best way to describe it. So I'm going to use your media as an example. So let's say you have media files. The media files are TV shows, music, movies. Maybe you have some home videos on it. Every single one of those can be its own shared folder. Or you can create one shared folder named media. And inside of the media folder, you can create 4 different subfolders, which you can then add all of your media to. The deciding factor, in my opinion, should be who should have access to it. So for example, if everybody should have access to the movies, TV shows, and music, then you create a media folder, give everybody access to it, and then inside of that media folder, you can create those 3 subfolders, and then everybody will have access to that. But if certain users shouldn't have access to any of that, and we'll use home videos as an example, what you really want to do is you want to create different shared folders for that, because inside of the actual shared folder, you can configure unique permissions, but it gets very messy. So I like to change permissions on a shared folder level. So let's quickly walk through what I just said. Inside of the shared folder here, we're going to create a shared folder, and we're going to name it media. Inside of here, if you don't want this shared folder to show up in the My Network places, you can check that off and hide subfolders and files from users without permission. This will basically be for when you access the shared folder. You can enable this or disable it based on the information that you see here and basically whatever you really want. Recycle bin. I would recommend that you enable the recycle bin. Some people don't, but I'd recommend that you enable it, and we'll take a look at a recycle bin emptying schedule a little later. But the recycle bin just ensures that if a file gets deleted, it will go to the recycle bin. It won't be permanently deleted. So moving on here, this is what we talked about a little earlier. So you can encrypt this folder, and you have 2 options that you can do. When you protect the shared folder by encrypting it, you can set up an encryption key, which is just a password, and it'll actually download an actual key as well. And you will need one of them in order to mount the shared folder and access it. So that is encrypting the shared folder. If you want to protect the shared folder with WriteOnce, so WriteOnce, read many. This is an interesting one. So WriteOnce, read many is truthfully something that home users are probably not going to use. Synology has a white paper on it, and if you think you want to actually use this, I would recommend you read through this and see if it makes sense for whatever use case you have. Businesses, small businesses, I would say are the users that could potentially use it, and then it goes all the way up to enterprise. But for home users, this is probably not something that home users would use, but the option is there if you want to use it. So depending on if you want to encrypt this shared folder, I'm just going to show you. If you select next here, you have to type in an encryption key, and you should do something secure here. But what you really then at that point would have is, in order to mount this shared folder, you would have to enter in that password in order to mount it. So it's encrypted until you mount it. And as soon as you mount it, then it's accessible on the NAS just like any other shared folder. So you're really protecting the actual mounting of the shared folder rather than the contents of the shared folder, because until it's mounted, you can't access it. And then once it's mounted, you can access it. So encryption's a unique one. If you have data that you're storing on your NAS and you really want to make sure that people can't access it, and periodically you have to mount it to just view the contents or update the contents, I do think encryption's a great option. But for a media folder, you're not going to use encryption most likely. So I'm going to skip that here. Enable data checksum for advanced data integrity. So a little earlier, we enabled scheduled data scrubbing. Data scrubbing will basically self-heal your files in the event that anything happens to the data. So think of silent corruption, things like that. In order to fix those issues, you have to use data scrubbing. In order for data scrubbing to work, you have to have this option enabled. So assuming that you're using Btrfs, I would recommend that you keep this on. That's a setting that I would recommend. Basically, you turn on if you're using Btrfs every time. I don't see any real reason not to. Shared folder quota, this will just say that the folder can't get above, we'll say 1 terabyte. You don't have to use this, but it is something that you could use. And file compression, it will actually lower the performance of this shared folder, but it will compress the data. I don't really use this. I don't have any side-by-side information on exactly how well it works, but if you're storing pictures that you never accessed, you might want to actually enable it for that, but the performance will be impacted. So we're going to select next, and we're going to select next again, and then we are going to get to the permissions. So like I said earlier, we have local users and we have local groups. The users that you create will have read-write access, but then in this local group section, you'll see users here. So if you have users and you want all of your users on your NAS to always access all of the shared folders, it's a good idea to come in here and grant the read-write permission, or read-only, whatever you'd prefer, to that individual group. If you have a small user base and you just want to manage permissions on an individual user level, you can do that as well. All of your users will be here. Any groups that you have created will be here. And system internal users, these are really just actual users for some of the packages that exist on the NAS. You're probably not going to go in here ever. You do have to configure it for Plex if you're using the Plex package, but we could discuss that later. So at that point, as soon as you apply this, our first shared folder has been created. So if we open up FileStation, you'll see that this is the media folder that we just created. And like I said earlier, we can come in here and we can create subfolders for all of our media. Now, like I said, you can actually modify individual permissions for a specific subfolder. I would not recommend that you do that. It's going to be a pain to manage. So in the case of what we said earlier, where we have our home movies and we don't want anybody to see them outside of specific users, but this data is a little less private, what we would do is go inside of here and we can create a new shared folder called home movies. And then we can run through the same process that we ran through earlier and we can create it. So the difference is that now the home movies folder can have a different permission level than the media folder. So if we had a bunch of users in here or a bunch of groups in here, we can go in and explicitly set what permissions should exist for whatever shared folder we have. So I'll apply that. But the one thing that I want to talk about, going back to the users and the groups, is when you edit a specific user in this permission tab, what you're going to see, and this is an admin user, so it's not a great example, but what you're going to see here is that The user preview shows their permissions. If you specify no access, the user will not have access to that shared folder. So when there is a conflict between user and group permissions, the permission is determined by level in the order no access, read write, read only. So what that means is that if you specify no access on the user level or the group level, the user will not have access to it. If you specify read write permission, they will have access to it, but if they have read only access anywhere else, they're going to have read write permission. And if you specify read only and read write or no access is not specified, then they will have read only permission. So what I did is I went through and I created a new user called Frank Test. And what you'll see here is that the user does not have access to anything. And the reason is because they're part of the users group, but the users group does not have access to any of those shared folders. So we have two ways that we could fix this. Let's say we want to give all of our users permission to the media folder. We can either do it individually. So if you have a small subset of users, you can come in here and specify. And then what you'll see is in the preview, they have read write permission, or you can say read only, and then they'll have read only permission. You could do it that way. Or you can go in and edit the users group, and you could say you want this users group to have read only permission on the media folder. And then what you'll see is if we go back and we edit Frank Test, go to permissions, you will see that on the media folder, we have read-only permission. So that's the power of creating users and groups. You can get permission through the group or you can get permission through the user account. Depending on how many users you have, one option will be better than others. If you have 15 users, you're going to want to create groups. If you have 3 users, you probably can just manage it on a user level. Not a right or wrong answer. Some of these other settings, the only other important thing I'd say in here is the application section. So if you want to explicitly say that this user should not be able to access DSM and should not be able to access FileStation, for example, then you can go in there and explicitly deny it, or vice versa, you can allow it. So everything else inside of here is, for the most part, fairly straightforward. There are some advanced settings. This is really just password settings. So if you have multiple users and you want to specify that they have to include a special character and their password expires after X amount of time, you can do that. User home service, this is used for specific applications. So when you enable the user home service, it's going to enable it on the actual volume. So when you apply it, what you'll see is inside of FileStation, we have a new homes folder, and every single one of our users has a folder. So think of the homes folder like a individual space. So my user account, Frank, has his own home folder, and my user account, Frank Test, has his own home folder, and both users cannot see each other's home data. So the important point here is that administrators can see everything. That's kind of just default. But if I was to come in here inside of this Frank, I create a folder here. What you'll see is in my home folder, so this is my home folder under the Frank user account, which I'm currently signed in as, it's here. So they're a mirror of each other because homes with an S is all of your users on the NAS and their user account. So if Frank Test came in here and had to edit a bunch of files, it would be in the individual homes folder for that user, and they would basically have a private section to add their data outside of administrators being able to see everything. Always remember that. Certain applications use this. So Synology Photos uses it for photo backups. Synology Drive uses it for personal documents. So certain applications will use that home folder, and you will have to enable it for some of those applications. But if you want to enable it for specific users to have their own private space, you can do that. It'll make a little bit more sense if you watch my video on Synology Drive, but we'll talk about Synology Drive a little later. We went through, we created a shared folder, we created a new user, we changed the permissions on that. What we're going to talk about now is actually accessing that shared folder. So we created a shared folder, but we have not actually added any data to it. So inside of DSM, if you wanted to just drag and drop a file here, you could. I would not recommend that you do that. But in certain situations, I'm sure that you could. It makes sense. I have used it in the past that way. But you have a few ways that you can access your data. The first is through FileStation. So with FileStation, there is actually a FileStation web server here. And if you wanted to customize the port, we'll just say that 7001 and went to the IP address and the port 7001 that we just configured, you would be able to access this. So this is a web version of Synology's FileStation. So if you sign out of this, what you'll see is it's its own application. So if you had users and you wanted them to access the data through a web browser, you could use this FileStation to actually access that data. So like I said earlier, same idea. You have all of your files, all of your data that you have access to. You can drag and drop files, and then you can just manage it through here if you wanted to. But most people are going to utilize these file services. So inside of here, we have file services, and most people are probably going to use SMB. So SMB will allow you to access the shared folder through a Mac or a PC by actually accessing it through either Finder or Windows Explorer. So what you'll see here is it is enabled by default, and there are some advanced settings that you could specify if you really wanted to. The only thing I would recommend you look at is SMB multi-channel. Inside of here, there's a bunch of other permissions, but without going too far into detail, because I have a full video on SMB multi-channel, and this is an advanced feature. SMB multi-channel will allow you to increase the actual throughput to the NAS so you could have faster transfer speeds if you were transferring a file from your device to your NAS. SMB multi-channel is a more advanced feature. You don't have to set that up now. If you do want to set it up after you get through this whole video, you can watch the SMB multi-channel video. I will leave a link to it in the description. But everything else, all these other settings can stay as default. So we have the SMB service enabled, which is this top section here. And in order to access it, we can access it by using this at the bottom. So I am on a Mac right now. And if I was to go back to my desktop and hit Command K, what you'll see here is that there is the connect to server. So I am going to type in SMB // and you can reference this by this line right here, SMB // and then this is the actual host name. I'm going to type in the IP address. So it's 10.2.0.59. And then I'm going to select connect. And then it's going to find it. It's going to select connect. And then this is going to be the user account on the NAS. So I'm going to sign in with my admin user account, which I said earlier you shouldn't do, but that's okay. And then we're going to access our, we'll say home movies. And there you go. We now have access to our shared folder on our NAS. So if I wanted to upload data from my device to my NAS, you can just drag and drop it and it will add it. And then inside of here, you will see if you open FileStation that in the home movies folder, the folder that we just created exists. So accessing SMB on your device is probably one of the easiest ways that you can transfer data back and forth. It transfers it through your network. So it's going to be slower than you're probably used to. That's where SMB multi-channel could work to increase those speeds, but you have to have two devices that support it. Watch the video if you want to do it. Or you set up increased networking throughput by setting up something like 10 gig, which I showed in the very beginning. That is how you can actually add files. So you might be asking, well, why didn't I see this media folder? Well, I didn't see that media folder because remember, we hid the folder in my network places. So if I wanted to, what I could do is hit Command K, come in here, type in media / media because that's the name of the folder, connect to it, and now we have our data. So that is what that setting will do. On Windows, it's slightly different. I'll overlay some video right now, but you're basically just open up a run command, and then you will type in / the IP address of the NAS, and then either the folder or you can just access the NAS and access whatever you have permission to on the NAS, which naturally leads us into the next step. So we just accessed our NAS through the IP address or the host name if you did it that way, but the IP address can change. So if you're using your NAS, you generally want it to have a static IP address, a static local IP address. What that means is that the IP address will never change. This means that if you reference it the same way that I just did, you're always going to access the NAS. It's not going to change on a reboot or something like that, and you won't be able to find it. So there's two ways you could do that. The first way is by setting up a DHCP reservation on your router. That is the better way of doing it because it will ensure that your DHCP server, which is on your router, will basically never hand out that IP address to any other device. If you can change it on your router, you should. I can't show that because every single router is going to be different. But the easy way that you could do that on your NAS as well, and like I said, not necessarily the preferred option, but an easy way you can do it is by going to the network section, selecting network interface, finding that network interface that is currently connected, selecting edit, and then select use manual configuration. So at this point, all these three, the subnet mask, gateway, DNS server, this is generally stuff that can stay as default. DHCP, which is what it was initially set to, means that it will go to your router and try to get an IP address. Very important for accessing the NAS the first time because you need to be able to get an IP address for it. But moving forward, you want that IP address to stay the same so that it never changes. You can do this on every single one of these interfaces. So the only other thing I'll mention is that this is the 10 gig network interface card. I am in an environment right now where I don't have a 10 gig switch. Normally this NAS is somewhere else. But if you have a 10 gig switch and you have the 10 gig NIC plugged in, this is where you would configure that as well. So all of your network interfaces, if you have a NAS that has 4 network ports, they'll all be listed here. This page will look different, but the key is that you can set a static IP address on every single one of the interfaces if you really want to, or on your router, which is preferable. And at that point, you can just leave this as DHCP because your router will never try and hand out a different IP address. But this is the quick and dirty way to ensure that the IP address does not change. So now that we talked through the networking settings, let's look at some of these security settings. So the reality is, from a security perspective with your NAS, you generally want to limit access to it from external locations. If it's on your local network and only on your local network, only the people on your local network can access it. So what does that allow us to do? Well, what that ensures is that you would basically have to have your network compromised either by a different device or a bad actor that's connected to your home network in order to attempt to access the actual NAS. So there's still security measures on the NAS here, which we'll take a look at. So getting access to the NAS doesn't automatically mean that they're going to have permission to it, but a few things that we could change. The first is the admin account. Make sure it stays as disabled, which it does by default, because the easiest thing to try and log into, the easiest user account, is admin. It's disabled. Nobody can access it through that, so you're fine. Some of these other settings we're going to take a look at is in the protection here. Auto block is enabled by default. This will ensure that if somebody tries to log in 10 times and fails within 5 minutes, that IP address will be blocked. Now, you can set a block expiration. So if you want to say after 3 days, that IP address will unblock, you can do that. If you don't want to, you don't have to. You can keep this checked. Denial of service, you can turn this on. This is really not going to impact you on your local network, but if you're exposing your NAS, which I would not recommend you do, but if you're exposing your NAS, that is a setting that you can enable to basically just protect from potential denial of service attacks. In the account section, so I would recommend that you do set up two-factor authentication for your admin account. So in order to do that, you can go into the personal settings here. You can go to security and you can configure two-factor authentication. And what this will allow you to do, you basically just have to run through the steps. You can either download the Synology application on your mobile phone and do it that way, or you can just use a verification code. Most people have a two-factor authentication app in this day and age. And what it would allow you to do is actually run through after you type your password in, and it will allow you to configure two-factor authentication. What this means is that if anybody was to access your actual user account, meaning that they had access to your password, they need a second factor in order to access it. So it's a number that changes every 30 seconds, and it ensures if somebody gets access to your password, they still do not have access to this second factor, so they won't be able to access the account. For admin accounts, you should definitely enable it. For user accounts, it's up to you, but it does depend on what the user has access to. If it's a user that has access to all of your data, you might want to enable it. If it's a user that doesn't, then you won't. Now, this only protects the login. So if you're accessing a shared folder through SMB, two-factor authentication is not used. So that's where, from a security perspective, things get a little fuzzy, because if somebody has access to your local network, they could potentially try and attack it using a different attack point than if it was exposed externally and they only had access to DSM. Just a few things to think through. The point here is that you want to enable two-factor authentication at minimum for your user accounts. And if you really want to enable it for everybody, you can enforce it and ensure that they do that. The only difference is that you'll have to configure the email service. And if you click OK, it will walk through how you can do that. But you'll have to set up a user service. Gmail is honestly the easiest. You just sign in with your Gmail account, and then it will use that moving forward. Some of these other things, the firewall is an interesting one, because I use the firewall, and I use Synology's firewall because I want to ensure that nobody has access to anything unless I specifically allow it. And it kind of keeps me in check. As a new user, you probably don't want to use the firewall. And if you're not exposing your NAS externally, it's even less important. But what this allows you to do is actually go in and specify what specific services you want users to be able to access. So if you wanted users to access SMB, for example, this Windows file server, even though it says Windows, it's actually for Windows and Mac because it's ports, I think 139 and 445. The SMB service utilizes those ports. So if you enable the firewall and you can't access your NAS through SMB, it's because you have to create a firewall rule. So I have a full video and article on the firewall. This is an advanced feature. I would not recommend you set it up right now. But after you fully configure your NAS, if you do want to set it up, this is where you can do it. The only other thing I want to point out here is that, as you can see, we are accessing the NAS on 10.2.0.59. That's the IP address, port 5000. So this is the HTTP port. So if we go to login portal, what you'll see here is HTTP is 5000. This means that the traffic to and from the NAS is unencrypted when I'm accessing DSM itself. I like to use HTTPS, which is port 5001. So if I was to put 5001 in here, I would get the actual HTTPS, which is encrypted. I like to turn on this automatically redirect HTTP connection to HTTPS. And as soon as you save that, what it will do is it's going to restart the web service. And you're going to see here in a second that we're going to go from port 5000 to 5001. The only thing here is that you might have to actually go in. Yep, there you go. You're going to get a certificate error because you don't have a valid certificate. That's okay. You are local and the traffic is still encrypted. And what you'll see now is we have HTTPS and port 5001. If you want to get rid of that error, and it's not an error, it's a warning. But if you want to get rid of that, you have to set up a certificate. You can either do a self-signed certificate. There's various ways you could do it. This is probably not something you have to worry about right now, but that error will be there until you set up a valid certificate. Not going over that. So inside of this login portal, the only other things I'll say is that if you want to change these ports from 5000 and 5001 to something and anything different, you can. So 5000 and 5001 are the known ports for Synology DSM. If you're exposing your NAS externally, you absolutely want to change these. For the majority of people, You don't have to worry about it. But if you want to change it, which we'll do 6250 and 6251. What you'll see here is as soon as you save it, what it's actually going to do is once again going to restart that web server, and then you'll have to use that new port. And now you can access it, but if you try to access it on port 5001, you're not going to be able to. And the reason is because we just changed the port from 5001 to 6251. So moving forward, you would have to access it this way. That option here, this automatically redirect HTTP requests, if you try to get to the HTTP version, meaning HTTP and the HTTP port, if you access it, it will automatically forward you to the HTTPS port. That's why I like to turn it on. So that is some security settings. We're going to talk about data protection in a little bit, but from a security perspective, those are some of the DSM settings you can kind of change. The only other thing I want to talk through is a UPS. A UPS is basically a battery backup. What it ensures is if your house ever loses power or wherever this is plugged in ever loses power, the NAS will stay online for as long as that battery will last for. So if you're buying a NAS that costs hundreds to potentially thousands of dollars with the hard drives included, you really want to purchase a UPS. You don't have to get anything fancy. Some people will recommend that you use UPS devices that are pure sine wave, which is the cleanest form of power. You don't have to worry about any of that. I'm not going to say that there aren't better and worse UPS devices, but if you're comparing a device, a NAS that doesn't have a UPS versus one that does, it's better to have one that does than one that doesn't. Now, if you want to go down the rabbit hole of UPS devices and start looking at pure sine wave NAS devices that are hundreds of dollars, you are free to do that. But something's better than nothing. That's the important part. So what I have is a 600 watt APC UPS that has a USB port on it. What that USB port allows me to do is monitor the UPS through the NAS. So what I mean by that is when I click this enable UPS support button, because the UPS right now is plugged into the NAS through the USB port, I can actually access this device and I can see that it's fully charged and it's connected. So inside of here, there are other settings. These settings are if you have a UPS server set up somewhere, don't worry about that. You're going to be accessing and connecting it through USB. So you have two options here. You can leave the NAS on until the battery is low in the UPS. So that is basically going to run through the entire battery. Once it hits a low state, it will automatically make the NAS go into standby mode. If you want to customize it to say that I want this to go off as soon as the UPS turns on, but after 5 minutes, you can do that as well. There's not a right or wrong answer here. It is whatever you'd prefer. A few other things. You can shut down the UPS when the system enters standby mode. I would probably not recommend that. And network UPS server, this will allow you to actually have other devices listen to the NAS if they want to shut down. So if you have multiple PCs, we'll say plugged into the UPS, what this setting will allow you to do is actually allow those devices to listen and see that it's on battery power and shut down. Advanced functionality, you don't have to worry about it. You literally have to check this box, make sure that you can connect to it by selecting this device information and then apply it. If you don't want to get a UPS, you run the risk of data corruption in the event of a power outage. It's not guaranteed it's going to happen, but if you're writing to your storage pool and you lose power at the right time, you could lose the entire storage pool. And at that point, you're out of luck. The only thing you can really do is restore from a backup to get your data back because you're not going to be able to recover that pool. Is it something that happens frequently? I can't comment on it. I have a UPS, but it is something that can happen. So for how much these cost, I think they're like $50. It's worth it, in my opinion. And if you want a bigger one because you want to put multiple things on it, they have various sizes. I'll leave a few links in the description to devices that I think you could use. But the important point here, get yourself a UPS. That's all I'm going to going to really say on that. Okay, so now that the UPS is configured, let's quickly take a look in Synology's Package Center. So you first have to agree to the terms if you agree. And this is where you're going to install all of the Synology packages. Now, I'm going to talk through a few of them here, but the point is that depending on exactly what you're trying to do, you're probably going to install different ones. We are going to walk through the ones that I consider to be the most important, but we'll talk through a few of them. So a lot of these applications here are basically just either like a sync tool or a way to manage the data, potential DNS server. These are all just default packages. You'll see that some of them are installed by default because these are packages that Synology pre-installed on the NAS. But some of them have to be installed. So a few that I want to point out here, Synology Drive Server. This is my personal favorite Synology NAS application. The setup process is way too long to go through in this video, but I have a full video that I did recently on how you can configure this. I'll leave a link in the description because you should finish this process and then potentially look to install that. But Synology Drive will allow you to sync data back and forth from your device to your NAS. It's a different way of accessing your data. So rather than using SMB, which we went over earlier, you could actually store the data on your physical device, edit it on your physical device, and it will automatically sync back and forth to your NAS. I love Synology Drive. Synology Photos is basically a photo backup tool. So what you can do is you can actually download and install a mobile application on your phone, and then it will allow you to configure a mobile backup, and you can view all of the data, all of your photos and your videos on your mobile device and have them live on your NAS. Pretty cool application. Virtual Machine Manager will allow you to install virtual machines if you wanted to set up any virtual machines. Definitely out of scope for this. And then the only other one I want to talk about is Container Manager. So if you've ever wanted to install Docker containers, Container Manager will allow you to do that. This application will basically really transform how powerful this NAS is. Definitely an advanced feature. I have a full video on Container Manager as well that I will leave in the description, but you could look at that later. All of this other stuff are just different applications that you can install. Okay, so now that we looked through some of these applications, I really want to talk through two main applications that you will use for data protection purposes. So to jump right back into it, the first thing that I recommend you install is Snapshot Replication. And once that is installed, we are going to then quickly install Hyper Backup as well. So as soon as they are installed, you can close out of here. And what you'll see is if you click this app section, you'll have both new applications. So we're first going to take a look at Snapshots. So Snapshots will allow you to basically freeze a shared folder at a point in time. This is good for things like ransomware or just basic backup and restore purposes. Snapshots are something that for all of the important data on your NAS, any of the shared folders that have important data, and realistically, you could set it up on all of them, but you want to configure a snapshot schedule. So if you select snapshots, what you'll see here is these are your shared folders. So I'm just going to walk through one of them. We'll do this media folder here. But in the settings here, if you select it, you can enable a snapshot schedule. Now from there, you can specify exactly when this snapshot should run. Generally, you want to run it daily. At least that's what I'd recommend. And then you could specify the time. We'll do daily at 2 a.m. Immutable snapshots, this will depend on the type of NAS that you have. But an immutable snapshot will basically ensure that the snapshot cannot be deleted for any reason based on however long of a duration you specify. So if you check this off and you specify 3 days, this will ensure that no matter what you do, this snapshot cannot be deleted. Now, keep that in mind. Whatever you do, the snapshot can't be deleted. So if you enable this and dump a bunch of data, you have to wait 3 days in order for you to potentially reclaim any of that storage space. So this is a more advanced feature, but it's great for ransomware because if you were to think of a bad actor that got access to your NAS and encrypted all of your files, knew what they were doing, and then went in and actually deleted all your snapshots, you're out of luck. With immutable snapshots, that's not the case because you have a protection period in X amount of days where you will ensure that all of that data is fine. Advanced feature, I'm not going to use it right now, but based on whatever you're storing, you might want to use it. Retention, the retention policy is very important. So you basically can keep the last X amount of snapshots. That is this first option here. The second option is going to be in days. So this is a little different. If you're taking one snapshot a day, then yes, both of these options are the same because this is going to basically be 128 days here. But let's say you actually set this snapshot schedule up to be, I don't know, every hour. Now you're going to have 24 snapshots a day. And if you keep all snapshots for 7 days, what that means is that you're going to have all of those 24 snapshots for 7 days. But if you keep 128 versions of that snapshot, you will have 128 versions of that snapshot. So basically 128 restore points in hourly increments, if that makes any sense. Not a right or wrong answer. It really depends on this schedule here. So if you're setting it for every day, you could just use this option, or you could do an advanced retention policy, and you can actually specify how often and how many versions you actually want to keep. This could be powerful, but keep in mind that if you're keeping a snapshot from a year ago, you're actually utilizing whatever storage space was on that snapshot. So you're going to be utilizing more storage space than if you didn't use this. Because basically, if you delete a file today, it's not actually going to be removed from the NAS until next year. So this is a more advanced function, we'll say, not from the sense of advanced functionality that's difficult to use, but advanced in the sense that you want to make sure that you keep only the amount of snapshots that you actually think you might have to restore from. But what I will say is there was one point in my life that I would have liked to go back to this past snapshot from a year ago, because it was a file that was deleted that I had really no idea it was deleted. And when I actually needed it, I was like, snapshot period has expired, so that file is gone. I was able to actually restore it from a backup, but we'll take a look at backups in a second here. But the retention policy is kind of important based on whatever you plan on doing. So we're going to set this for 7 days, and we're going to select OK. And now the snapshot will be scheduled. So at some point tonight, it will run through and it will take a snapshot. You can take manual snapshots. You can take a snapshot and you can lock it. Locking it just means that you will have to manually delete it. It won't automatically delete based on your retention policy. And you can even do a manual immutable snapshot. So I'm going to take a snapshot here just to show you how this works. But what you'll see is in this snapshot list, we actually have a snapshot. That's the snapshot I just took. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into this media folder and I'm going to delete all this stuff. In this media folder, all the folders I had are now gone. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my snapshot list. I'm going to select it and I'm going to browse it. And if you browse it, it says make snapshot visible. What that means is in File Station, you will now have this snapshot folder. That's what visible means. But you will see here that all 3 of those folders are back. So what I could do at that point is I could either go through and manually copy them over, or if it's just an individual file, I can go and find that file, copy it back to the shared folder. Or different option is, let's say we didn't want to do it this way. So we're going to go into the advanced settings for this folder, and we're going to do that so that the snapshot is not visible. And then you'll see the data still does not exist. So in the event of ransomware, you probably don't want to do it that way. What you'd have to do is actually restore the entire shared folder. What Snapshots will allow you to do is in this recovery tab, you can select recover on whatever shared folder it is, browse to the actual version that you want to restore, and restore to this snapshot. So you can take a snapshot before restoring if you wanted to. In my case, this is just a blank folder. So you can even restore the settings of the shared folder, but none of the permissions changed. If permissions changed, you might want to do that. And as soon as you hit OK, what it's actually going to do is in the background, it will run through and it will restore that folder. And what you'll see is all of our data is back. So I've used snapshots as a first line of defense. If I have a file or folder that is deleted, I go back to the snapshot and I restore it. Snapshots, you have to utilize Btrfs for it, which was the Btrfs volume we configured. I think you can actually configure it with ext4, but it's not going to utilize deduplication, so you're going to take up a ton of storage space. Btrfs is preferred for this option and something that I think everybody should use. So snapshots are the first line of defense. Now, snapshots are not a backup. If for some reason this storage pool was to corrupt, that data's gone. Nothing we could do to restore it because the snapshot is part of the storage pool. The storage pool is corrupt. It's gone. At that point, what you have to configure is a backup. So we're going to look at hyper backup. Hyper backup will allow you to back up your NAS. So what you'll see here is as soon as you launch it, you'll have a few options here. You can actually back up the entire NAS if you wanted to. That includes everything, all your shared folders, all your packages, everything. If you ever had to restore from it, the actual hyper backup archive will basically be a restoration of that entire NAS. For me in this video, we're not going to do that. We're going to just do the shared folder. But as soon as you select it, you will have a few options here. So these are the destinations for where you can actually back up the data. So my personal favorite option, I use Backblaze B2. I'm not sponsored by them. I don't have any affiliate links. I'm just telling you who I personally use. That's done through the S3 storage option here, but you don't have to use them. If you just have a small amount of data or you have a Google Drive account that you want to utilize or Dropbox, you can do that as well. The other thing you can do is you can actually back up to a remote NAS. So if you have a second Synology NAS and it's somewhere offsite, for example, you can actually back up to an offsite NAS. Third option, which is what most people would do, is a external USB drive. So I'll leave a few links in the description for external USB drives that you could use that I know work. But basically you just plug in the external hard drive directly into the NAS and you would see it. Okay, so to just show you how this works, I just plugged in an 8 gig USB stick, which would never be used for this, but just to show you. And in FileStation, what you'll see is I now have a USB share folder. That USB share folder is actually that device. You can see all of your devices in the control panel by selecting external devices, and it'll all be listed here. So inside of Hyper Backup here, if I actually close out of this and recreate that task and select USB, multiple versions, I will have that USB share. And then what I'd be able to do is go through and select whatever I want to actually back up to it. We'll back everything up to it, including the applications. You can back up all the applications if you want as well. And then you specify the backup. So I will run this daily at 3 a.m. The only other thing you might want to enable is client-side encryption. Client-side encryption will encrypt this backup. In order for you to actually access it, you're going to need the password. When you use it and you configure a password, it will also provide an encryption key. So you'll need either the encryption key, which is a file, or this password in order to actually access the data. If you're backing up offsite somewhere in the cloud, I would recommend that you use that. If you're backing up locally to a USB drive, it's up to you. I mean, if somebody was to come and physically take the device, they'd be able to access the data on it. So from that perspective, maybe you want to, but if it's all in your house and you feel comfortable, you don't have to do this for this test. I'm not going to enable this. The only other thing is for USB drives, remove destination external device when backup task has successfully finished. This is a blessing and a curse because you will then remove the drive after the backup runs. So God forbid anybody was to access the NAS, they can't access the files on the actual USB drive, but it's a curse in the sense that it's going to stay ejected until you add it back. It's up to you. It's better to automatically, it's better to keep this on, but it's also a lot more inconvenient. So the choice is yours. So then I'm going to select next, backup rotation. This is just the number of versions that we're going to keep. I'm going to set this to 30. And then done. And then what you will see is that it'll ask you to back up. So it will quickly run through the backup. Now this is a backup. So this is a backup from your NAS to a secondary device, potentially even in the cloud, and you can restore that data. Okay, so this USB stick is obviously not big enough to do this, so it failed for that reason. So what I did is I just configured a second task, and I just moved it to, we're backing up the media folders. We're actually backing up all the data on the NAS to the home movies folder, just so I could show you how this works. But the idea is that if a snapshot is compromised, meaning that you can't access the snapshots and that doesn't work and you have to actually restore the data, you can restore it right from here. So to show you the same example, we will delete all of the data inside of this media folder, and it's gone. And then what we will do is we will use the Backup Explorer to navigate to this, and then we can actually select the three of them. We can select Restore on the file. All right, so it restored all the folders back to the media folder, and you'll see now they're back. They're all there. So this is how you would do a hyper backup restore. Everything that you have in the backup will be shown here, and on the bottom here you'll have versions. So if you have 30 versions of the file, you'll be able to go back, however many versions it is until it exists, and actually restore that individual file or folder. But the key here is this is a backup. So unlike snapshots, which is not a backup, this is a backup. Just keep in mind that if you're using an external hard drive and it's directly next to the NAS, someone can either take the external hard drive, or in a worst case scenario where the actual NAS is compromised, meaning that a bit of fire or something like that, the hard drive is going to be gone too. So that's why people say for a 3-2-1 backup, you want 3 copies of your data on at least 2 separate mediums with 1 offsite. The offsite protects from that scenario. So that is snapshots and hyper backup. So a backup of the NAS. From a data protection standpoint, in my opinion, those are the most important things that you can configure. You have to configure backups and snapshots. This will protect you in scenarios that you probably can't even think about right now. So just trust me, there's going to come a point where you need that, and you do want to set that up. So we now talked through the package center. So like I said, there are a ton of applications that you can install, and one way or another, every one of these applications will do something different. You can go through, and based on whatever you're trying to do, you can configure it. But the next thing I want to quickly talk through is remote access. So the most common thing is that you set up your NAS, it's configured the way you want, it has your data on it, but you leave your house now and you lose access to it. So you need to come up with a way to access that data remotely. I have a video on 5 ways that you could do it, but I'm going to quickly summarize it here. That video goes a little more in depth. I'm going to quickly summarize it here. The best option, in my opinion, is through a VPN. If you have a VPN on your router, you can configure it there. You can configure OpenVPN or WireGuard if you have it on there. If you want a separate device, you can run it on a Raspberry Pi. You can run OpenVPN or WireGuard on a Raspberry Pi as well. And I have tutorials for a lot of this that I'll leave in the description. But if you want to access it and configure it on your NAS as well, you can do that. So inside of the package center, there is a VPN server application that you can install. And what this will allow you to do is configure OpenVPN on your NAS. Now, it's a full setup process. I have an article that will walk through the entire thing. But the idea is that if you open up the VPN server, you can enable the VPN server and change all these settings. Honestly, just quickly looking at this, all of this is fine. Allow clients to access servers LAN. That would basically allow you to access the other device on your local network. So when you set up a VPN, you're not only accessing your NAS, you're accessing all of the devices on your local network. So this could be beneficial if you have to if you have to access another device, you could do it through this. So the VPN could be for multiple purposes. The thing I'll say is after you apply it, it'll have a configuration file that you will have to edit and modify. You will have to port forward. So you'll have to port forward on your router to your NAS. This is a bigger setup process, so I don't really want to go any deeper into this, and it's definitely an advanced feature. But the idea is that you will have a secure tunnel from whatever location you're at back to your home network where your NAS lives. And at that point, you connect to the VPN, and then you will be able to connect to your NAS. That is the most secure option. You have to be able to port forward though. If you don't want to do this whole setup, there's actually a package in the package center called Tailscale. Tailscale is a zero config VPN. So I have a video on this as well, but it's extremely easy to set this up. You would be able to get this set up in probably 5 or 10 minutes. Downside is you're relying on a third party, so this is not going to be a self-hosted VPN server. This is going to be a VPN server that you connect to. So if Tailscale is ever having any problems, you wouldn't be able to access your data. But I love Tailscale, and I have a bunch of people I know that regularly use it, and it just works so well, and it's so easy to set up. And if you cannot port forward or you do not feel comfortable port forwarding, Tailscale will actually allow you to access all of your services and everything directly through that without having to do really any advanced setup. It's very, very easy. So check that article out if you want to set up Tailscale. So those are your VPN options. Those are the options that I would recommend. The easiest option by a landslide is QuickConnect. So inside of the external access here, there is the QuickConnect setting here, and you'll have to sign into your Synology account, which I will quickly do. Okay, so if you don't have a Synology account, you're gonna have to set that up if you wanna use QuickConnect. But the idea here is that you can come in and type in a QuickConnect ID, and then when you apply that, what it will do is it will connect back to the Synology servers, and then it will allow you to access it through that QuickConnect ID. Few notes here. In the advanced settings, these are the applications that you can access. So you can access DSM, you can access all of these services, Synology Photo, Synology Drive, all these mobile applications, all of these services. You could share files externally, and it does use a relay service. So Synology will relay the traffic to your NAS. It's not going to be the best from a performance perspective. A VPN would be better. Self-hosted VPN would be best, at least in comparison to this. If you're using port forwarding, that's the best performance. But I digress. So a VPN will perform better than this, but this is a lot easier. I signed into my Synology account. I enabled QuickConnect, and now I can basically access all of these services through this QuickConnect ID. So if you pull up Synology Drive on your mobile phone, it'll ask you for a QuickConnect ID or a IP address. If you type in the QuickConnect ID that I have here, WunderTech testing, what that would actually allow you to do is sign in to that actual service from wherever you are, and you would be able to access that service. That's how simple it is. So that's option 2. Option 3 would be DDNS. So you can configure DDNS, and DDNS basically will track your external IP address. So remember up top here, 10.2.0.59, that's our internal IP address. Your external IP address, you have one of them. It's given to you by your ISP. Generally, it changes. So DDNS will always track it. If for whatever reason it changes, you would, by using that DDNS host name, be able to access that external IP address from wherever you are. Downside is it requires port forwarding. So if you use DDNS to access your NAS externally, you have to change this port. You have to make sure it's something different than 5001, because port scanners will scan for 5000 and 5001, and you will be hit with attacks. I can almost promise you. That's number 1. Number 2, I don't recommend you do this. I'm just telling you that you can do it. It'll be the best performance because it's going to be a direct connection from whatever location you're at to your actual NAS, but you have to utilize port forwarding. It's not secure, and it's just not something I recommend, but you can do it. The only other thing you could do is configure a reverse proxy. I'm not even going to talk through that, because a reverse proxy, you have to own your own domain. You have to port forward, and it works differently. I do love reverse proxies. I think they're great, but I have an article that I will leave in the description if you really do want to configure that, because it is something that is a little bit more advanced than I really want to get to in this video. Those are the ways that you can access your NAS outside of your local network. If you go to a friend's house and you type in this local IP address on their network, you're not going to access your NAS. You have to have a way back to your local network to access your NAS. That's the main thing to remember. A lot of this other stuff is really just some best practice settings. So I mentioned this earlier. I have a full article that removes all the fluff. So that article will be basically a step-by-step guide on exactly what I think you should do, all the settings I think you should have enabled. It removed all the fluff. And it's just kind of a real short, it's not a short article, but it's a short and sweet in the sense that it says, this is what I think you should do, this is why I think you should do it, and this is where you can find it. The few things that I will quickly talk through that are in that article is the recycle bin empty schedule. So in the task scheduler, make sure you go to create, schedule task, and then recycle bin. And then from there, you can create a task. You can make sure it runs daily. And then you want to empty all of your recycle bins, but you probably want to do it after, let's say, 14 days. If you don't set up a recycle bin emptying task, what it's actually going to do is it's going to store all of that data. So when you delete a file, it's never going to be removed from your NAS. You have to set this up, or you have to manually empty the recycle bin. There's not a right or wrong answer. The reason I recommend this is because most people forget to manually do it. So by doing this, you're ensuring that it will actually work when you need it to work. So we'll click OK on that, and we will set that up. Everything else here, I think we did a pretty good job of going through everything. There's a lot more to this. Notifications, you know, this will be the final thing I'll talk through. Notifications, you want to set up notifications because there's going to come a point in time where this NAS is something that you don't log into regularly. And when that time comes, you're going to want notifications in case something goes wrong. So if you set up, data scrubbing and it doesn't work properly, if you have a bad hard drive, if something happens on your NAS, you have to make sure that you're notified of it, because there's going to come a point where you go from logging into this daily to weekly to monthly to maybe even less frequently than that. Setting up notifications will ensure that if anything happens, you are notified of it. All you have to do is set up the email, which we talked about a little earlier, so you could use Gmail if you want. So when you set that up, what it will do is it will actually set up a recipient profile here, and then you're going to see rules. There's going to be a default profile, but those rules will be based on basically all of these rules. So you'll see external storage, if the connection failed. The big ones are going to be potentially in the power system if you want to know when your UPS turns on. And then more importantly would be in the storage. In case you have any, hard drive issues, you'll be notified of them. You really want to set these up because this will ensure that the NAS informs you if anything goes wrong. So like I said, email, configure email. I'm not signed in right now, otherwise I would, but it's very straightforward. You're just going to sign into your Gmail account, configure that, and then you'll have a setting here where you can actually go in and modify what you want to get alerted on. And there might be things you're going to get alerted on that you don't want to get alerted on, so you can disable those as well. Okay, so there are going to be other settings I'm probably forgetting, but at this point, you're going to have a full Synology NAS set up following some of the best practices that you can use, and you can slowly start to build on top of it. So like I said earlier, there are a lot of different things that you can do with this device, even just creating Docker containers, stuff like that you might want to start exploring, but you're not currently ready to do that. You can do all of that at this point because the NAS is configured following some of the best practices, and hopefully you understand the DSM operating system a little better than you did. Most of it is really just creating the shared folders. You'll have to go through and obviously create more of those, and then potentially create your users, and you'll have to go through and slowly tinker a little bit around. But for the most part, the NAS is configured the way that it should be, and you can start to use it. So a lot of tutorials that I will leave in the description. Synology Drive, Container Manager, 5 ways you can access your NAS remotely, stuff like that. Those are all videos you can use to build on top of what you currently have, but this video walked through it all. So I'm hopeful that you found this video helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing to the channel. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Thanks, guys.